held against me in a court of law.
Can and will.
Can and will. A little bit of housekeeping. I received some constructive criticism last time that I was kind of breezing through some of these verses, just giving you the chapter and not the actual verse. And I realized that that's not a good thing because some people are taking notes and want to refer back to these. So I redid the outline and brought it up to date. And what I did was list. I listed the verses that I'm doing. So I think this is going to help you. And if somebody will pass these out, there's 2 parts to it. 2 pages. That's kind of an outline of where we've been and where we plan to end up today if we can. And what I did is under each section simply put the actual verses down that we have used last week or we're going to be using this week. And I think that'll help you, not having to jot it down real quick, you'll be able to see it. There was also something I want to mention that I got as feedback. I love getting feedback. And I'm just going to read you this because I think it's very productive. There is a part last week where I talked about retirement, and I said nowhere in the Bible does it tell us about retirement. Well, lo and behold, somebody found it. So here's a verse that they came up with. It says, this is what applies to the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall enter to perform service in the work of the tent of meetings. But at the age of 50 years, they shall retire from service in the work and not work anymore. They may, however, assist their brothers in the tent of meeting to keep an obligation, but they themselves shall do no work. Thus you shall deal with the Levites concerning their obligations. And this comes from Numbers chapter 8, verses 24 to 26. Having read that, I am now officially retired. But I'll be glad to help you all out with these. Okay, I thought that was good, and I appreciate that type of information. You know, last time we discussed God's role, and when we talked about God's role, we talked about things like that He is Lord, He is in control, He is the provider. And the whole thought of this sometimes makes us believe, well, look, He's in control. What do we have to do? We don't have to worry about anything. He's got us. Well, no, there's our role. You know, and in His role, the term we used for Him was Lord. Lord, owner of everything. We talked about, again, ownership, control, and provision. Now we're going to get into our part, and we're going to see not only what God says about us, but specifically what He says in terms of what our duties and what our roles are, and where there's Bible verses, you know, we will share them. The word that best describes our role is stewards. A steward is somebody who is in charge of another person's possessions or money. Our responsibility is summed up in this verse, which comes from 1 Corinthians 4:2. It is required of stewards that one be found faithful. You know, faithful is what God is looking for us. I was at a church service a couple of weeks ago for A.J. Salas, and one of his friends got up when we were talking about having the opportunity to say something about it, and they summed him up with the word faithful. And I thought to myself, wow, if that could be how I was thought of, how great would that be? And that's what God expects us to be, faithful. Not concerned with how much we have or how little we have, but faithful with whatever we give. But before we can be faithful, we have to find out what it is that we need to do to be faithful. And that's what we're going to kind of go over, because there's a couple of things. One is we can be faithful with what we are given. Again, I've used this analogy before, but it's like playing in a card game. And God is not concerned with how good our cards are, because some are going to be dealt good cards in life, and some are going to be dealt bad cards, and some are going to be dealt mediocre cards. But God is concerned about how we handle and deal with the hand that we're dealt. There's an old saying that instead of worrying about $1 million that we might have, maybe we should be worried about what we're doing with the $10 that we do have. So the focus again here, from a biblical standpoint, is not how much we have, but what we do with what we do have. Be faithful with what we are given. There's an interesting parable about the talents, where if you recall, God, or the master in this case, gives 5 talents to one, I think 2 talents to the next, and then 1 talent to the other. What was interesting is the person that got 2 talents received the same reward as the person that received 5 talents. Again, a biblical example that it's not the amount. The next area is that we be faithful in every area. I think that we're taught as Christians to deal with the 10% of our money that we give to God. And again, we'll talk about that 10% number later. But the other 90%, we tend to think that, well, we're in control of that. We'll deal with that. We don't really get much from a standpoint as Christians teaching on what to do with that other 90%. Obviously some of us are better at it than others, but wrong attitudes toward possessions often cause us to make poor financial decisions with painful consequences. If you would turn to and read, and you don't have to, I have it down for you, Hosea chapter 4, verse 6. It says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Again, trying to spend a little bit of time on finding out how does God expect us to handle that other 90%. And that has to do with a lot of things. Debt, that we'll talk about later on, is just one of them. But there are certainly benefits of handling money faithfully. And we're going to talk about 3 benefits that you have when you handle money faithfully. Am I going along too fast? Does anybody have any questions? I don't mind you jumping in at any point. One of the benefits is that we receive a more intimate fellowship with Jesus Christ. Remember what the master said to his servant who had been faithful with his finances. This comes from Matthew 25, verse 21. Enter into the joy of your master. We can be joyful when we're faithful. When we're faithful, whatever God chooses to give us, we can be joyful in that. Because if we're handling it the way God expects us to handle possessions or money, then we're doing the right thing. The second reason is the development of character. God uses money to refine character. Even though it is done unconsciously, money molds people in the process of getting it, saving it, spending it, and using it. And depending on how money is used, it can be a blessing or a curse. Does anyone have any thoughts on how money can develop your character? Maybe you've been in a particular situation.
Well, it changes people, sometimes to the worse. When they get money, they're not used to having it, and they get it really quick. It can really cause problems.
Yeah, I think of some of these football players.
Right.
Celebrities, athletes.
Receive these big contracts and millions of dollars, and a couple of years later they're broke.
Yeah.
Jamarcus Russell comes to the answer. John?
You know, it's interesting, Larry, when my father died, he didn't leave any particular instructions as to what was to happen with his estate. So I got together with my 3 sisters, and we're not talking about millions of dollars now or hundreds of millions of dollars now. We're talking about less than $10,000. And one of my sisters turned into an individual none of the rest of us recognized. Just that little bit. It didn't take millions. It just took a little that she didn't have that now she could have. And it completely changed her personality. It completely changed her values. It was amazing to us how much it changed her and transformed her into something we didn't even recognize. And I'm talking about thousands of dollars only, less than nothing compared to the world, not millions. So it doesn't take much. She's not a believer, so as far as we know. So that's an interesting thing to think about. It doesn't take much.
I think what God wants us to get out of this particular area is that part of His plan is to build character in us. And sometimes He uses money to do that. And part of this study says if we learn the biblical way of dealing with money, you know, we're talking about, again, spending it, saving it, giving it. If we can do that, it'll develop our character. And that's one of the things that we hope to get out of it. Pastor Eric talked today about the sanctification process. When we relate it here, it's a process where we're learning and growing how to deal with money from a biblical standpoint. It takes on a whole new perspective.
Larry, one other point. I firmly believe that if you do not take actions to master your money will master you. Somebody's going to be in charge. It's either going to be you or your money. It's not a neutral situation. The flesh and the spirit are always at war with one another. So if you don't master it, there's the possibility, there's the temptation, there's the risk that it will master you.
That's right. All through scriptures, there's a correlation between the development of people's character and how they handle money. You know, you can tell a lot about a person if we were to examine, or someone were to examine, our checkbook and our credit card statements, because that'll tell us what's important to us. Where are we spending our money? Where's it going? Where are our priorities? And sometimes if you go through that process of examining your checkbook and your credit card statements, you might find that the results are ugly. So, as John points out, depending on how it is used, it can be a blessing or a curse. You know, either you're going to be in control of your money, or your money's going to be in control of you. The last point here is to have our finances in order. You know, as we apply God's principles to our finances, we can begin to get out of debt, spend more wisely, start saving for the future, and even give more to the work of Christ. There are 3 principles of faithfulness. One is that if we waste possessions, God may remove us as stewards. Luke 16, verses 1 and 2 says, there was a certain rich man who had a manager or steward who was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, for you can no longer be steward." There's 2 points here I want you to pick up. One is that this person's actions became public knowledge. That's how it got reported to the manager. You know, as Christians, we should be aware of how others may view us. And if we deal in the wrong ways as far as money, I think about myself, I'm a financial advisor. Just imagine if I did something unethical, how that would reflect on other Christians, how it would reflect on all of you to find that out. I mean, it's very important that we not only look at the consequences to ourselves. I mean, the consequences, the other part of this was that the stewardship was taken away from them. But the real question here, in my mind, is what damage does it do to not only your character, but what damage does it do to your light that you're trying to shine as a Christian person? Suppose a businessman, and this is a story, but suppose a businessman reports to his employees that he's got to cut back because times are tight. And so he cuts back, he doesn't give bonuses, he cuts back on some hours and gets tight on expenses. And then a few weeks later, he goes on a lavish vacation. You know, it's a reflection on everyone there that sees what he's doing. You know, we have a responsibility as Christians, not only for ourselves, but how other people view us.
Well, if we had when I was a young kid, a long time ago, worked part-time at this place, and minimum wage was, X amount of dollars. Well, the government said, okay, well, now the minimum wage is this much. Well, the guy gave us the raise all the prices on his food, like, to make up for it. Well, 2 months later, he found out, I don't have to give y'all that much money, I'm bringing you back to where you were, but didn't bring the prices back down. And, a lot of employees, I didn't stay there that long. It was a job I hated in the first place.
But it's another good example of what the public sees and how they view us. There's another point here, and that is that we must be faithful in little things. Luke 16:10 says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much." You know, sometimes a little thing is a big thing. And it starts with little things. Is it okay to tell a little lie? John, is it okay to tell just a little lie?
Well, I just whispered to Ginny, what is a white lie?
Yeah.
You heard that term? A white lie? What is that? It's a lie. That's what a white lie is. It's a lie.
Well, that speaks to integrity right
Yes,
there.
it does.
Everybody's probably heard this, but integrity is, doing the right thing when people aren't watching, and that's, if you do right in the little things, you're doing right in the big things.
Right. How do you know if your son is going to take care of his first car? Luke, how do you know if your son's going to take care of his first car? How can you tell? Car, automobile.
Well, I know the son doesn't take care.
You gotta set the example.
Yeah.
How
How
do
did
you
you
know?
take care of your first call?
Yeah, you gotta set the example.
Let's go beyond that.
Or how did he take care of his bicycle?
There you go. That's what I'm looking for. How did he take care of his bicycle? If he didn't take care of his bicycle, chances are good he's not gonna take care of his car. If I hire a salesperson, excuse me, there'll be 100 women marching on Mandeville Bible Church tomorrow. If I hire a salesperson and turn over a small client to that person, and they do not do a good job with that small client, let's say small in financial terms, somebody just has a little bit amount of money. If they don't do a good job with that client, how can I expect them to do a good job with a client that has a lot of money, a big client? You know, we can always look at what are the little things and how are we handling little things to determine maybe how that person's gonna handle bigger things.
Larry, I got a little problem with that, though.
Okay?
As we judge others, we need to be careful. You know, I had a financial advisor once who the very first action I did with him was a disaster. It didn't go well. I lost money. That was one time. That wasn't his history. That wasn't his capability. That wasn't how well he usually does. So that first time, that needs to be forgiven and moved on, and give someone a little bit of grace and a little room, and the relationship can continue. So we need to be careful in the little things. Is it a one-time thing that happened? Is it a mistake? Is it an error that's asked for forgiveness and moved on from? Or is it a character trait that is always there? We need to be careful about that.
I agree. I think in the light of what we're talking about is that in general, small things and the way you deal with small things might give us a picture of how you deal with larger things. And yet what John says is absolutely true, is that anybody can make a mistake or anybody could have a roadblock here or there. And I don't think that's the vein that I'm asking you to think
Are we
about.
talking about attitude, really?
Yeah, is he,
His attitude towards his
Attitude's
job?
part of it, yes. Attitude.
is he being lazy?
Or irresponsible, or not doing his job
Right.
when he knows better? And
Yeah,
this would lead-
it's a multiple of
It's a
things.
multiple.
I just think, I'm speaking in generalities here, and that is, if we look, you know, we should be, here's the point, we should be very careful with how we deal with even the little things. Because little things are important also, and sometimes little things can determine how we can handle big things. It has absolutely nothing to do with a person who might make a mistake here or there, or have a roadblock here or there. And those things all add into it, as far as what you're saying, and your attitude and other things.
Larry, just one more little thing on here. I had a friend of mine that said, he called it the coffee stain test, and I said, what is that? And he said, if I ever get on an airplane, a jet, and if I flip down the little table, and if there's a coffee stain on the little table, he said, I'm wondering, what does the engine look like when I'm 30,000 feet in the air?
Good point. All right, another area is that we must be faithful with another's possessions. And we can turn to Luke 16, verse 12, where it says, if you have not been faithful in your use of which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? It's always amazing to me that we can actually go to the Bible and see very specifics about some of these areas. How many of you has experienced lending something to somebody and having to go beg them to get it back?
Oh, yeah.
And then, are you gonna get it back in good condition?
Do you want
My kids are borrowing stuff all the time. I told them I'm gonna start making them sign out for it and write down the dates they took it, because they
Take a
never seem
picture
to
of it.
remember.
Take a picture before you give it to him.
Yeah. Or I'll go to get it back and say, oh, that broke. Yeah. So they felt absolutely no responsibility to get it fixed and then give it back to me. You know, office supplies. How many of us take office supplies for personal things back home? Steve, you work business one.
Yeah.
You know, is it just a fact that that's what people do? That's what your employees do? How many people leave the light on or the TV on in the hotel room because I'm not paying anymore, I've already paid for the hotel room? How many people feel a responsibility? Yeah, I think it's clear that what God's telling us here is to be responsible with another's things. Take care of them, bring them back in good order, bring them back promptly. Don't use things that aren't yours. It's a little thing, but it can be a big thing. God promises to do His part. Our part in our financing is to grow in faithfulness, to be faithful. Any other thoughts on that before we turn to the next area?
Hey Larry, I think there's something we hadn't really touched on, but it's part of all that is there an aspect of humility involved in that? You know, talking about being faithful in the little stuff and faithful in the big stuff. You've got to be humble enough to say, I'm going to do my job, even though I consider this to be a small thing. There's some humility involved. There's some humility involved in taking care of somebody else's stuff. It's not your own. So sort of, I think that's part of what we're talking about. God wants us to be humble.
Good point. Any others? Okay, the next area that we'll finish on today with is debt. And boy, debt is tough. A lot of us are going to have different opinions on debt. You know, we can talk about some debt that may be considered good debt, or a better word for good debt would be permissible debt. And we can debate it. You know, from a biblical perspective, we can tell you that there's nowhere that I could find that debt is a sin. But certainly, there's a lot of places that we can find that shows us that God discourages debt. And logically, when we do get in debt, we should be working to get out of debt. But somewhere in there, and this is the financial advisor guy in me, gets very analytical in terms of which debt needs to be dealt with first. You know, sort of a priority. And I think we can kind of look at that as we go along. But anybody that has any thoughts on this as we go through it, it's probably not wrong. You know, it's your opinion. And our opinions don't count for a whole lot. You know, there's only one handbook for the Christian, and that's this guy right here. And we're fortunate enough that God gives it to us, and where we can go to it and see what it says about that, we want to do that. And then where it doesn't say anything specific, I think we need to use our common sense. And we'll talk another week about counsel. Sometimes people need to have some counsel, and we'll talk about the type of people that maybe you should go to. And I'm not talking about financial advisors. A financial advisor may be one of them. I'm talking about people like your parents, your pastor, a Christian business person, or Christian friend. But seeking counsel should not be discouraged. You should not feel like that hurts your ego to go talk to someone and getting help. So what is debt? It's anything we owe. Anybody, any person. The amount of debt in our nation has exploded. I think it's reaching $20 trillion. It's incredible. The average household spends more than it makes. More than 50% of all divorces are a result of financial problems. We got the old Madison Avenue saying, right? What is that? Buy now and pay later. You know, we're influenced by that. We're influenced so much by our culture and the media. The dictionary defines debt as money that a person is obligated to pay to another. Bills that come due, such as your monthly electric bill, are not considered debt if they're paid on time. You know, I was going to throw numbers at you, but I'm going to kind of skip over this. You know, we can talk about what debt really costs, and I could throw specific numbers at you. But the truth of it is, if you're paying $1,000 a year in interest on debt, it's astronomical if we compound that out, what it'll grow to over time. And the numbers are staggering because, you know, we take, I was dealing with a person a while back with some mutual funds that I was selling, and they asked me about fees. And I told them what fees that are being charged, and they said, well, they're going to get a CD from the bank because the bank doesn't charge any fees. I can get a CD for 2%, and they don't charge any fees. I get the whole 2%. I said, do you have a credit card? She said, yes. I said, well, you're paying that bank back 18%. So there's a 16% fee on that 2% CD. You're really paying 18%. You know? So understand that just because there's no fee when you look at something doesn't mean that there isn't. And when you're paying interest, somebody else is using your money to make more money. You're going to need to learn to become your own bank. That's the side you want to be on. You know, growing money can be huge in terms of what you can accumulate. You know, there's a rule of 72 in the business that says if I make 7% on money, 7.2 to be exact, in 10 years that money will double. So if you're saving money at 7%, 10 years it's going to double. What if you're saving money at 2%? Well, you take the 2% and you divide it into 72, and you find out it takes 36 years for your money to double. So if I start throwing compound interest numbers at you, it might, you know, confuse you a little bit, but the point is that every dollar you pay in debt is money that if you didn't have to pay it in debt, you could have saved it, and depending on what you saved it at, it could accumulate it and did a lot for you. So keep in mind that debt is very costly. I looked at one number in particular where the same person that paid $1,000 in debt a year in credit cards over 40 years, if the bank took and earned 18% on that, they wound up with over $4 million. So these numbers are huge. Don't get caught up in the dollar amount that says, well, I only paid this much this year in credit card debt or finance debt or whatnot. Try and look at the big picture. It can accumulate to and mean a lot. Let's see what the Bible says about debt. This is what's really important. Again, it's not what I think or you think. You know, what does the big guy say? That's where I want to go. What does the big guy say about debt? Again, doesn't specifically say it's a sin, but certainly it discourages. Romans 13:8 says, and we can look at this from several different translations, but it basically reads in these different ways. Owe no man anything. Let no debt remain outstanding. Pay all your debts. Owe nothing to anyone. Keep out of debt and owe no man anything. I think it's very clear. Debt is also considered slavery. Proverbs 22 verse 7 reads, just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is a servant to the lender. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 23, Paul writes, "You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men." That was considered a curse. In the Old Testament, being out of debt was one of the promised rewards for obedience. Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 and 2, and also 12. "If you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings will come upon you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow." However, that was also one of the curses for disobedience. If we turn to Deuteronomy 28, verses 15, and verses 43 and 44, we read as follows. "If you do not obey the Lord your God to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes with which I charge you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. The alien who is among you shall rise above you higher and higher, but you will go down lower and lower. He shall lend to you, but you will not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you will be the tail."
Boy, that sounds like China in the United States, doesn't it? 18% of our debt.
It's consistent here, and I'm trying to show you a consistent pattern of what God is telling us about debt. Debt presumes upon tomorrow. The Bible cautions us against presumption. James 4, verses 13 to 15. "You who say, today or tomorrow we shall go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and also do this or that." Debt may deny God an opportunity. Think about Nick and Eric, and I don't know their personal situations, maybe they might share something, but for many a seminary student, it's very difficult because most of them don't have the money just to go do this and quit working. And sometimes you work and you go through it and you get through it. And I'm sure there's been some seminary students who have borrowed the money. But I can tell you that, if you put your trust in God and you worked and tried to get through it, I think you're going to be better off than coming out of the seminary with a big pile of debt. And I don't know if either one of you care to share anything more on that. But if it's a case of you not doing it because you are in debt, or this was a problem or an issue and you couldn't really do it, then that debt is denying you an opportunity to serve the Lord.
Hey, Larry. I see two kinds of debt. There's a debt of need and a debt of want. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I
now,
want that boat. I want to have that boat.
we talked about that earlier when we talked about God's part in providing. He tells us he's going to provide for our needs. We don't have to worry about our needs. What are our needs again? Food, clothing, shelter. He doesn't tell us he's going to provide for our wants. He may. He may do some of them. He may do all of our wants. I don't know. He may give some to others. And some people have 2 cars and 3 bedrooms, and some people have 1 car and 1 bedroom. That's God's determination, and when it gets down to it, but yes, it's a good point, you're absolutely right. The other thing I want to say about that is this too, and we can get into this more as we go along, but we have to be realistic. You know, we can talk about somebody going out and paying cash for a car, but if you don't have cash for a car, you're going to finance it. And sometimes you can go out and look at, well, maybe I have cash for a used car. But if you don't have cash for a used car, it's hard to buy a used car because the finance rates on a used car are greater than the finance rates on a new car. So the answer would be try and save the cash for the used car. But sometimes the realistic thing is we go out and we finance an automobile, and that's okay. You work to pay it off. Again, that's not biblical, okay? That's my opinion, and everybody else is going to have different opinions on things about that. The Bible is pretty solid on when we can owe money. I don't think there's a lot in there that I could turn you to as far as verses go, but I think a lot of it is common sense. And what we do know is that he discourages debt, and when we are in debt, he wants us to get out of debt. The item purchase, if it's an asset or something has the potential to appreciate or produce income, would be something that I would consider permissible debt. Again, I'm not going to call it good debt. Someone once said, no debt is good debt. but permissible debt. I think that the house is a good purchase off, but in one of my classes, somebody was saying that, you can't have any debt and whatnot, and yet they were buying a home. And you were buying a home because it was a good financial decision to buy a home. In the long run, you would have something that you own. You could deduct the mortgage interest. And it was the logical, common sense thing to do. But if you're so strict that you don't believe you should ever get in debt, then you never should have bought the house. You just rent for the rest of your life. There's nothing here that I can turn to, but I just can't believe that God wants you to rent and not buy a house. I think God wants you to buy a house if you can afford it, but he wants you to work toward paying it off. Now we'll talk about the priorities of paying off one versus the other, but I think that's a good example of something that presumably appreciates in value, but not all the time. How many people do we know today that have houses that are worth less than they paid for? And that's why when you are buying a house, you ought to try and at least put up a down payment of at least 20% if you can. For two reasons: you're buying some immediate equity, and the other reason is you stay away from P&I insurance, P&M insurance. I forget what the name of this, but it's insurance you pay if your debt to equity ratio is not above a certain number. Just keep in mind that you don't want the debt to be too high. A lot of people overbuy when they buy a house. There's numbers that banks and financial institutions can give you that show a ratio, and they'll do that in the process of you applying for a loan. But what you want to do is make sure that this is affordable. Look at the notes and figure it out. Also be leery of adjustable mortgages. Interest rates took a hike in January, and they're going to take more hikes, I'm pretty sure of it. And somebody that started out with a low note can get to a high note pretty quickly if the interest rates are adjustable and going up. Interest rates are pretty low today, and it's a great opportunity to take advantage of fixed rates. That's another permissible debt that I would tell somebody, and that is that if they're in an adjustable mortgage now, consider refinancing and getting a fixed mortgage while the rates are relatively low. We talked about automobiles, very difficult. for many, just to go pay cash for a car today. So how do we get out of debt? Once we get into debt, how do we get out of debt? Well, first of all, we pray. It's the first step. Seek God's help and guidance in your journey to getting out of debt. And it should be a journey for all of us to get out of debt. You know, I passed out some forms, and there's still some back there. You know, if you haven't done so, list all of your debt. Write it down, list it, so that you can work on a plan and have a journey to one day get out of debt. That should be what we're working on. You know, I tell people to do and look at financial statements and review them every year, and one of the things you should be seeing is your situation getting better. Even if you're only paying a small amount of your debt off, look and see that you're having progress every year, and that number is getting lower. I don't think God does not want us to have nice things and be able to enjoy life and the richness in it. You know, there's a question of whether we should get into debt to do it or not. And I understand that some purchases, I don't know, I'll give you an example, is a boat. Somebody might buy a boat for their pleasure. Again, this is not biblical, this is my opinion. You know, there's two ways to go. You can buy a used boat that you can pay cash for, or you can finance a new boat. But if you do finance a new boat, make sure that the number works comfortably in your budget. It's not a strain on your budget. Make sure that it's something you can pay and then work to pay it off. Somebody else may have a different opinion, though. You know, we can all have different opinions on that. I want you to understand that I'm very realistic, and I don't expect everybody in this room to be completely debt-free. And some of us may well be, and that's good. You know, God has blessed you, and you've done a good job, and you've been faithful, and that's good. But for those of us that still remain in debt, what God wants us to do is not be discouraged and not beat ourselves up, but He wants us to use what we're learning and be faithful in trying to get out of debt. We were talking about how to get out of debt, and I mentioned praying. You know, as we begin to get out of or eliminate debt, God blesses our faithfulness. One of the verses that I didn't write down for some reason or the other, but it comes from 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. Would somebody like to go there for me? 2 Kings verse 4. Chapter 4, I'm sorry, verses 1 to 7.
You wrote it down, Larry, it's on here.
Yeah. Did I write the verse down?
It's on number 4, debt, notice debt. You got it there.
Verses 1 to 7?
Yeah.
You
I
want to
don't
read
have
that?
it on this sheet, this what I'm, yeah, go ahead and read it from the state if you will.
Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be slaves. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? And she said, Your handmaid doesn't have anything in the house except a pot of oil. Then he said, Go borrow vessels from all your neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when you are come in, you shall shut the door upon yourself and upon your sons, and you shall pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said to her, There is not a vessel more, and the oil stopped flowing. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go, sell the oil, and pay your debt, and live, and thy children on the rest.
And the moral of that story is that sometimes God blesses our faithfulness. And then He may bless us in different ways. You know, I can recall early on in our marriage, one of our children needed a coat. And I was in a small Bible study group and we prayed about it. And next day a coat appeared on our doorstep. Obviously it was somebody in the group. But you know, God blesses faithfulness. And sometimes He provides for us in different ways. You know, besides praying, you can take some practical steps to getting out of debt. You might sell some things that you're not using. Many of us, including me, are hoarders of certain things. I have this huge baseball card collection. You know, take a look at things. You know, is it something that I really don't need? Needs versus wants, right? And can it be used to get me out of debt? Decide which debts to pay off first. Again, you know, you can prioritize things. You know, you use a practical method of looking at what interest rate you pay. I mean, if I'm paying 3% on a home mortgage and the interest rate is deductible, that's not going to be the first thing I pay off. If I'm paying 18% on a credit card, that's going to be the very first thing I try and pay off. And then, you know, the old saying is you start with a smaller debt, you pay that off, pay minimum payments everywhere else, pay maximum payments to get that one paid off, and then work on the next one, and so forth. You create a snowball strategy. I've even told some young couples that I've dealt with in the financial world to consider getting another job because the debt is overwhelming. You know, go to work at Walmart at night or something, do something. I mean, the burden of the debt was tremendous. It was ironic because they came in to me wanting to put some money aside for retirement and into a mutual fund. I said, heck no. You know, you need to get out of this debt. You need to focus on that. In fact, I've told people to take money out of their 401ks and pay off debt. Taxes and penalties. Money out of your retirement to pay off debt. That's how strongly I feel about somebody. Control the use of plastic. Wow. You know, my wife has a checkbook and she feels like as long as this check's remaining, she must still have money. Plastic, wow, that can be the death of us. You really need to control it. It's a convenience. But you know, the reality is that if I'm dealing out cash dollars for something, I'm seeing more what it costs. But when I'm putting that plastic up, I don't see what it costs. Maybe at the end of the month, when I'm paying the credit card off, I see what it costs. But the best thing I can say is that plastic sometimes leads us into a false sense of security because we're spending money that we don't see until sometimes it's too late. And before long, you look up and that balance is huge. And paying minimum payments isn't going to get it. The interest rates we talked about is phenomenal. Sometimes it requires plastic surgery. with a pair of scissors. You know,
Oh, Larry?
go ahead.
Yeah, I taught my sons that because, boy, when you're in college, it's almost like the banks can't wait to put plastics in your kids' hands. And I taught them that you can use the plastic as a tool, and I wasn't going to pay for it, But use it as a tool, and if you find you can't pay it off the full balance in a month, you can't use that tool anymore. You've got to put it away until that balance is paid off.
Right.
And that served them well, that principle.
Yeah, and I think as parents, that's something that we should work with our children on. We have an obligation to teach them finances. The next thing is to be content with what you have. You know, so many of us just are not content with what we have. We want something bigger and better, and there again, you deal with Madison Avenue, you deal with TV, you deal with the culture, you know, that we're facing today. You deserve this. Right, Rich? Don't you deserve
It's a great
that new
advertisement,
fishing pole?
yeah. You see it all the time.
So, you know, it's learning to be content. You know, there's a story about a company that opened up somewhere in Africa or somewhere, and they were paying people for different things, and they got money, and they went out and they quit coming to work because they had everything they needed. So they start sending them catalogs and brochures, and then they went to work again because they wanted to buy all of these things. So be content, you know. And sometimes, you know, it just requires a radical change in your lifestyle, you know, with this commitment to work on and get out of debt. But do not give up. You know, in the words of Winston Churchill's speech when World War II was devastating Europe, never give in. Never give in. Never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. So don't give in. Develop a plan for debt elimination, create a journey, and hopefully you get there. Yeah.
Real quick, can we back up just one to the contentment? I was looking here in the 1 Timothy verses here.
All right.
It says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therefore with content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in the destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves with many sorrows. But thou, O man of God, it says, flee these things, and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness.
Yeah, another great verse, and there's lots of them. We said there was over 3,000 of them, and I'm just giving you a handful, but that's a good one. I think we're pretty much at the point where we need to close. Next week, I want to touch on the home mortgage a little more, investment debt, business debt, church debt, and the responsibilities of repayment, co-signing, and learning a little bit more about your credit.
Larry, something I'd like you to do for us, if you can, is I look at this national debt thing, and I say, what can I, as an individual Christian, do to address national debt? So I just wanted to give you that warning. I'm not asking you the question now. I'm asking you if you could address that to us at some time, about what is our responsibility in regards to national debt? What do we do about it? How should we approach it? What do we need to know about that as individual Christians?
Okay. Well, thank you. There's, besides that sheet on debt, if you want to take it to list your debt, there's another piece there. I think I have about 30 of these books, which should be enough for everybody. It's an estate organizer that I use for my clients. So feel free to take one. They're in that box back there on your way out. It's a good way of putting down a lot of information. It includes your wills and who the attorney is, and CPA, and assets, and with banks. And so it's a nice piece. Feel free to take it and use it.